Hello and welcome to Economic Forum. My name is Tawanda Gudlanga. You will recall in our previous episodes, we invited a tax expert to give us a scope of tax in the country. This week, we have invited from the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, Mr. RAMECK MASAIRA. He is the commissioner in charge of domestic taxes. Sir, thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you, Tawanda.
Now, very interesting points were raised last time when we were seeking to understand tax issues from an independent mindset. And quite a number of them were raised, which we shall unpack. But let's first look at the impact of COVID-19 to tax in Zimbabwe.
We've not been spared, as it were, by this pandemic. Zimbabwe has experienced the pandemic on a different levels. The biggest impact that we have experienced as an economy, as a country, refers the extent to which business has continued to run. You will agree with me, Tawanda, that in terms of tax generation, it is actually a product of an economic activity. The moment that the economic activity is subdued, is affected, you ordinarily would expect that the level of revenue performance would be impacted. The good thing that we experienced in terms of our revenue performance is that while least one would expect that negative results would come as a result of that, when the first lockdown was introduced, I think around March, then when you look at the tax environment, you are looking at transactions that happened before March, which ordinarily would mean that the revenues that we were then collecting during the month of April were in respect of transactions that happened before the lockdown was introduced. And naturally that had an impact in as far as our revenue performance is concerned. However, because as a nation, when the first lockdown was introduced, no one was ready, no one was prepared. It created a kind of shock in terms of the entire system, in terms of the entire value chain. So it required that we had to put in place responses that would enable the continuous collection of revenue. As you all know, that tax revenue is the major source of government funding. Therefore, we had to start working on skeletal operations as an organization, organized ourselves into skeletal staff that would then focus on making sure that the revenue that was so critical, not only for government operations, but also very important in as far as funding even COVID-19 related expenditure. So the need for us to continuously generate the revenue was paramount. Then we therefore had to put in place structures that would then be able to follow up and monitor our clients, who are the registered taxpayers, to make sure that they are informed in terms of how they are supposed to pay their taxes. We put in place systems like automated systems, relied more on technology, relied more on the setup we've had as an organization in as far as making sure that the different type or different sectors of the economy are properly segmented. You will agree with me, Tawanda, that we do have the reasonably informed, well-informed sector of our economy who are able and they have put in place structures that are good for purposes of tax compliance. You are looking at your multinationals, you are looking at your mining sector, you are looking at your established businesses that reasonably have got and understand the need to adequately comply with the tax requirements.
But let's just quickly touch on the new normal that is in the ICT sector. Like you're saying that you had also gone automation. How successful were you in that regard? Because there were some reports that really it was difficult to access ZIMRA as it were during that particular period.
For purposes of making sure that cash flows for government, we remain to bring in the revenue that is critical for government operations. I would want to say it was fairly successful, right? Because in as far as that area is concerned, we succeeded in meeting our mandate, meeting the revenue targets. But there are other areas, Tawanda, that obviously suffered as a result of the glitches experienced as we were trying to put in place a framework that recognizes the need for social distancing, the need for making sure that you don't expose your staff to the pandemic. And as a result, because of the reduced number of people and the transition from the old way of doing things, created some glitches. So to that extent, we have had our service delivery receiving a battery. Our clients were not getting response on a timely basis. And you would find that whereas we would have a one-on-one relationship between the taxpayer and the officer, because of the shift work that we introduced at the time, and when the taxpayer or a business or a partner requires a service from a particular liaison officer that we call them in ZIMRA, the response rate was not as the best it should be. That naturally also would impact on the level of our revenue performance, to the extent that we think we could even have done better if those were working well. But we remain challenged. We think that it is an opportunity for us to embrace the new normal and make sure that what we are doing is a starting point where we continuously stabilize the framework that we have put in place, and make sure that whatever challenges we've been experiencing are learning points that we'll continue to deal with.
Join us after the break as we really seek to understand the multiple pricing system and the tax system in Zimbabwe. Join us there. Welcome back. This is the Economic Forum, where we are focusing on tax issues in Zimbabwe. And in the studio, we have invited from the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, ZIMRA, Mr. RAMECK MASAIRA, who is the Commissioner in charge of domestic taxes. Now, Mr. MASAIRA, let's talk about your targets. Where do you base your targets on? And you've always, I must say congratulations in this case, you're always meeting your targets and probably exceeding them. But is it not a case of celebrating having to catch a mouse as opposed to actually having to catch an actual elephant? Because they say that what is actually taken from, what is actually collected by the taxman should actually go back to the taxpayer in the form of service delivery, infrastructure development, but we don't seem to see those.
We will continue to celebrate the good work that we are doing as an authority, making sure that we provide for our government the resources that are so critical for socio-economic obligation that our government has. And to speak to your question in terms of whether we are collecting enough or whether we are really scratching the surface, as it were, or even before I talk about that issue, you must understand the basis on which our targets are set. These are a function of the GDP, gross domestic product of the economy. And these are provided by the parent ministry, that is the Ministry of Minister of Finance and Economic Development. They then dictated to us, after having carried out the necessary economic analysis and carried out the evaluation in terms of what the projections are of the economy. Then once those numbers are given, we have to put in place systems and structures that then make sure we deliver on those targets. In terms of comparing, there are obviously other benchmarking that we can talk about. When you're looking at revenue performance as a ratio of the GDP, it gives you a number then you can compare with what is happening elsewhere, either within the region or within other economic areas. We are doing fairly well. There is, however, issues that we then need to say in terms of growth. To what extent are we happy? We believe that the scope from a revenue authority perspective, and we are challenged that when we compare what we are doing now and what we have been doing during the multi-currency era, you definitely see that there has been some movement that we think are leaving a little bit of a gap, and we are focused as an authority of making sure that we have strategies that talk to closing those gaps that are currently existing.
What sort of strategies are you?
Yeah, the strategies are then making sure that, one, we do understand and appreciate where the revenue is coming from. Right? Segmentation of our clients is key. You then want to make sure that those that bring in 80% of the revenue, you have put in place structures that talk to them having easy of tax compliance.
Who happen to be players in the small to medium enterprise?
No, not that type of a sector. There is still a lot of work that we need to do in as far as the small to medium enterprise sector is concerned. But you are looking largely at the established business as the major players in as far as revenue contribution is concerned.
Is that not where your Achilles heel is as an authority, where you are only focusing on blue chips and not the SME sector, where the money is actually exchanging hands and where tax should actually be paid?
Yeah, it's not necessarily focusing only on the blue chips, Tawanda. I've alluded to the fact that we have segmented our taxpayer population into those that the blue chips you're alluding to, and there are those within the middle of the class, and those that are on the lower end of the class. These are different type of taxpayers who require different approaches in as far as tax administration and tax compliance issues are concerned. The bigger boys and bigger girls and the ladies and those guys who are in that league, who have got well-established tax function within their organizations, have a fair understanding of what's happening there. So, but what you need then to do is to make sure that you put in place systems that will enable them to comply with very little hassles. So that's the purpose why we put those structures in place. Then you have the middle of the road, that your medium clients group who need hand-holding, who need to be guided more often, much more than the first lot I've talked about. Again, this is another sector that you're focusing. And then you look at your small guys who would want to call micro, who you would think that in terms of the complexity of our tax environment, they struggle, systems, they don't have computerized systems, you ask them to use technology to file, they'll struggle. Okay, then that is a group, that's the majority of our taxpayers who are on the register. That's the biggest number. But the contribution from that type of a sector is not that attractive. The biggest group that I've alluded to, Tawanda, which brings in 80% of the revenue, is the one that is organized.
But why is it not attractive, Mr. MASAIRA, given the fact that that's where the money is, as it is perceived?
It's a question of us having to establish in terms of the economic activity, in terms of, I hope and trust that you are talking about the informal sector.
The informal sector.
Yeah, these are guys who rely much more on the activities that they are undertaking on a day-by-day basis. They don't have formalized structures. They don't have organized way of doing business. It's almost like a survival approach. And the question is, how you then design a tax system that cater for that type of a client? Okay, that's when you start talking about the withholding taxes, right? When you talk of the 2% tax, Tawanda, it does catch those guys. When they do their mobile money transactions, they will not escape the 2%. When you do your RTGS in the bank, you will not escape the 2%. When you do your automated, I think, the swiping in the shops, you will not escape the 2%.
But it's rather punitive, don't you think, as opposed to having a scenario where you should have these small players, the informal players, actually having to find it as an obligation to pay tax. Let's talk about that in the third and final segment, and also we will be touching on the Forex issues. Join us there. Welcome back. We are focusing on tax issues here on Economic Forum, and we have with us from the Revenue Authority, Mr. RAMECK MASAIRA, who is the Commissioner in charge of domestic taxes. Obviously, this issue you should be seized with, Mr. MASAIRA, where we talk about strategies that actually, enhance revenue collection and also appreciation of what tax does to a country. Are there any strategies that are in place when it now comes to conscientization of the citizens in paying their taxes?
Thank you so much. I think that's a critical issue that you raised, Tawanda. To start with, let's look at our local environment. Okay, we do have a dynamic and seriously sophisticated economic environment, which I think our government has tried very well to try and create a framework that can assist in making sure that all the transactions that we undertake is either as consumers or as a business community or in whatever form we do, they are subject to the appropriate type of taxes as provided for by the law. Okay? So the question now is, to what extent have we put structures for us to be able to then make sure that because of COVID-19 pandemic that then gave birth to the reintroduction of multi-currency, we have seen more and more of re-dollarization of the economy. And when you look at the provisions of the tax legislation, they are very clear in terms of how do you pay taxes when you are dealing in multi-currency. The law requires that the tax should be paid in the currency of transaction. The challenge now has been in terms of systems to start with, the business community, the enterprise, if they put in place systems that then are able to clearly provide a clear record of the transaction that has been undertaken for purposes of then saying, as and when the tax is due, it is paid not only correctly, but in the correct currency. So we have embarked on a campaign that we are educating the business community of the need to comply with the law, to make sure that the transactions that are entered into on the basis of a foreign currency tax must be payable in foreign currency. And we have seen an encouraging response from the business community. It is encouraging, but there is scope for us to do better. The challenges that again have been raised by the business community, which I think is no excuse in as far as complying with the law is concerned, while there may still be challenges in as far as administratively systems, technology, it's incumbent upon every business person to then make sure that they are put in place systems that will allow or that will provide for correct tax to be paid, notwithstanding that there are challenges that we're experiencing. So that's the biggest message that I'm giving out there. Record correctly the transactions in the correct currency. Then the next issue is the consumer needs to have confidence as a starting point when they are dealing with your business, to make sure that as they carry out the transaction, when you are paid in US dollar, you must give the consumer a receipt that reflects the currency in which they have paid. Because why is it important to do that? You will still have business people that also want to use that transaction for purposes of recording their own transaction, for accounting for their own transactions. That is, as they do their profit and loss, or as they do those things, they need to have a correct record. So it's incumbent upon every business person to make sure that the record is proper. From a VAT perspective, we expect that for those that have registered for VAT, they must have a tax invoice that complies with the VAT legislation. Otherwise, they won't be able to claim input tax for their VAT purposes. So the message we are sending out there, from a consumer perspective, some kind of consumerism, we have already put in place a program that we are asking you and me and every consumer to insist on the correct record. When you pay in United States dollars, your receipt must reflect that you have paid in United States dollars. When you pay in local currency, it must reflect that you have paid in local currency. If you pay in Pula, it must reflect as such. So that is key, that is important.
But let's look at the rate of conviction, prosecution and conviction of those that are actually breaching the law. We hardly hear of such stories coming out. Is it that there's collusion between your liaison officers and those that are actually practicing that are doing unethical practices in ways of doing tax?
Our approach, Tawanda, is to say you start by giving your business partner an opportunity to put their house in order. This is the phase in which we are in. Working together, they are clear in terms of putting structures, give them time to transition from the old system into the new system, right? You educate everybody that they are aligned, you provide solutions, guidance in terms of fiscalization of their promises. That's the first phase that we are working with. We'll then get to the second phase where we are simply saying, if you are not too clear in terms of what you have declared as a business, please come forward and declare your areas that you have not fully complied with. We definitely are receptive to those kind of approaches, and we are running what we call a voluntary disclosure program that caters for that. We eventually, obviously, are going to go the naming and shaming route, which is the prosecution that you are alluding to. Because you have those that have not taken advantage of these initial programs of where we are asking people to voluntarily comply, where we are asking people to declare areas they have not complied voluntarily. And we are then saying, when we discover that you have not properly complied and we have given you enough time to put your house in order, we'll definitely come with the prosecution, and it's coming. That we definitely are working on.
It's coming. You've fired salvos. You've issued such subtle warnings, but they sort of just fizzle away, Mr. MASAIRA, and it still continues and unabated. How serious can ZIMRA be taken when we look at issues of tax leakages or tax evasion, as it were?
We remain committed to making sure that once we start on naming and shaming and dealing with the prosecution issues, we succeed in those. But you must also know that it's not an isolated process. We work together with other key players as far as that prosecution process is concerned. And this is the legal system has got its own way in which it operates. Okay? So we have to work within that framework in order for us then to make sure that whenever a case is picked up, for it to get its logical conclusions, all the players within, I'm not really blaming anyone, but just to admit that the process itself leaves scope for us even to improve on it and make sure that when we come, we really come. You get messages like if you listen to some of your celebrities in other jurisdictions where it's reported that a soccer player so and so has not complied with their taxes, and the noise is so huge. We have, unfortunately, I'm unable to name and shame in this program, but there are examples where this has happened. If you were to go into the press, you'll see a few characters, outspoken characters for your information that have had the experiences in as far as our prosecution process is concerned.
Mr. RAMECK MASAIRA, so little time, so much to talk about. We hope you will find time to come back to the studio so that we can focus more on tax issues in the country.
Thank you so much.
That was our guest, Mr. RAMECK MASAIRA, who is the Commissioner in charge of domestic taxes at the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, ZIMRA, as he was unpacking the tax situation in the country before, during, and as we look forward to a more relaxed environment during this COVID-19 pandemic. Join us again next time on Economic Forum. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until then, it's pleasant listening and viewing.